I'm getting sick of this behavior. Let's have a look. Hello everyone, Florian here and welcome to another episode of HeiseSays. Grab your stein of coffee because I want to talk about a recent article that came out, and let's just bring it up here. This is from news.com.au and it features auctioneer Tom Panos, where he's recording himself in a clip about a barista, working obviously at one of his local coffee shops there. Now, he's saying that he'll have to work for 45 years just to get a deposit. This is a wage crisis here we have in Australia. Now, it makes for a good headline. It got my attention. But it also pissed me off. I'm sick and tired of this bullshit. Here's the reality. Australia is not like what it was 40, 50, 60 years ago. We've changed. We've got a population level that has increased significantly. Now, here's the harsh reality. If you're working as a barista, a job where you can acquire the skills within a week to do, you're not going to be able to demand as much for your services, for your time, as other professions and other trades. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a fine job. But do not expect to be able to buy a house in Sydney, one of the most in-demand places in the world, unless you can command sufficient money for your time. This is the harsh reality of it. So if you've gotten to a point in your life where you're my age, working a job like that, someone should have given you that truth bomb. It's unrealistic to expect that. Would you expect someone in Victorian England or London to be able to afford a house unless they commanded a good wage? No, of course not. That's ludicrous. And sadly, that's where we're heading now. This has probably got more to say with the changing nature of Australia. I've discussed this many times in the past. We're going to have a widening two-tier society, if not more, particularly from the middle class who are in housing and are reaping the benefits of the limited supply we're being able to provide on the market, compared to those that don't and are stuck in renting for extended periods of time. And it's just going to get worse. But going there and recording a guy working at his job and saying, you'll never be able to afford a deposit, or how the hell is that going to make him feel? And he's a young bloke. This is a shit kicker job that you do, maybe while you're studying, maybe as a stepping stone on your life. That's part of the deal. That's normal. I mean, do you really think someone who's working in a job where, frankly, you could do it in a week? Okay, you don't need to train to be an auctioneer. You don't need to train to be a real estate agent. You don't need to go do a trade for years. You don't need to study university for nearly a decade. So what do people expect? I think this is just a whole bunch of clickbait bullshit to point and laugh. I mean, we're now in a time in our country where you need two people to save a deposit for a house. Going back to the fantasy of having just, the breadwinner. In the past, it was the dad going off to work, earning enough money to support a family. That doesn't exist anymore. We've got a culture that encourages both parties in a relationship to work. And, I mean, okay, all for fantastic, everyone gets to work, but, I mean, come on. We've lost the choice. It used to be a choice. Now it's pretty much required. So if you want to get a house, you need to be in a couple. I'm just wondering if it'll turn into a throuple one day. Probably. In Sydney, it probably is, to be brutally honest. Let's keep going. So let's read through this article. An auctioneer has laid bare the grim truth about Australia's housing future in a short clip pointing out the sad reality of Australia's wages. Our wages are actually some of the highest in the world. And think about how much of a component labor is in housing costs, and how, well, perhaps that's a reason why new builds go up in costs so much. Every year we've got new legislation, new changes, new costs driving up. If you're not familiar with the iron law of wages, look at it. Tom Panos has been vocal on social media recently, I think he's been vocal for a while, amid Australia's gargantuan cost of living increases, which has forced many young people to spend money they would normally be saving for a house on soaring supermarket bills and skyrocketing rent increases. That's true. I mean, here's the thing. What's one of the biggest cost of living increases we have? Or what's one of the biggest things that's draining away your money every single paycheck? Is it your food? Is it your rent? Probably rent is probably right up there. A big chunk of it's your taxes too. Wouldn't it be nice if, I haven't gone through the budget, we'll have to do it on a live stream, guys, but wouldn't it be nice if some of that surplus was returned to people? In this latest video, the real estate coach painted a bleak picture for the average cafe worker, who he said would have to save vigorously for their entire life just to get a deposit for the most basic dwelling. Okay, now, are you going to be a cafe worker for your whole life? Okay, we got the guy here, look at him, young, he will have opportunities throughout his whole life to go down multiple paths. Speaking as an old, middle-aged demi-boomer, you've got lots of opportunities. You shouldn't be stuck being a cafe worker your whole time. Maybe you want to run the cafe. Maybe you want to start your own business. Maybe you need to have ambition. Or perhaps this is just the male perspective of things. It's a little different. You've got to step up. You've got to take care of you. No one's going to give a shit. Everyone will talk about, housing deposits are so tough. You don't want to fall into the victim mentality where you are expecting others to take care of you, where you're expecting entitled to the government. People will feed you all these promises and all this bullshit. They don't give a shit about you. They just want to use you for their own political game. That's what it's for. So you've got to take care of yourself. You've got to skill up. You've got to find other opportunities, ways to demand more for your time. And it's not fair. And sure, you could look at the boomers or previous generations, some of the cost of housing compared to their wages. Sure, but they were buying a house not in an in-demand city. They were buying it out on the periphery, the suburbs, in the middle of bloody nowhere with no utilities or services. In a time where you haven't had generations demanding more and more increases to performance requirements, more and more legislation demanding all these changes to housing. And we've looked at these houses people were buying back in the day. You can't get them anymore. Like a little two-bedder with maybe the luxury extra of a carport stuck to the side compared to the stuff that people are churning out now. And you've got to understand, you can't really blame the developers for trying to maximize the properties they build because their headworks, their charges, the hoops they have to jump through, they don't create any incentive to build smaller starter homes. So the guy behind us, he's making 20 or 30 an hour. Works his ass off while filming himself getting a coffee at a cafe. 20 to 30 bucks an hour. Just think about that. That flows through to the cost of that business. It flows through the cost of the coffee you're paying. Everyone will advocate for increases to wages because they argue, it's a good thing. Give people a fair shake, a fair try. But you've got to appreciate the fact that flows through the entire economy. If someone on a minimum wage, their wage goes up, every single person will expect their wages also to go up relative to that. Because you're thinking, okay, why is Jimmy there earning so much with very low skills? Where I've worked all these years, got all these skills. That means the cost of my coffee is going to go up. The cost of this is going to go up. So I'll demand an increase of wage. That goes up. It flows through the economy. It's really the first mover advantage, and it runs out. We're all paying for it. If this guy starts saving up, he'll be able to get a deposit for a property when he's at the age of 63. I wonder how much faster he could get a deposit for a property if he could use his superannuation to access it. Previous generations didn't have that. They didn't have 10, what was it, 12, 14% now? They keep putting it up. They didn't have that siphoned out of their money, a nanny state government forcing them to save for their own good. Notice how one thing I saw in the budget is rent assistance for pensioners has gone up. That's the thing that could disappear if you had everyone owning their own home or more people getting into their home. We want home ownership, guys. Or maybe that's only certain sides of the political spectrum want home ownership. Others want to keep a large proportion of our population renting or dependent on others. When you've got everyone worried about Brittany Higgins, and this guy is going to have to work for 45 years just to get a deposit. Well, that's if he hooks up with someone else, they get together, you cut that in half, 20 years to save a deposit. Still bullshit. Maybe he's going to have to do something else. Maybe get a side gig, work a little bit extra, do some Ubering, before you get to the shift. Start a TikTok channel about, idiots filming you in your bloody cafe when you're trying to work. It's probably not a bad idea. Look at what you're making people do to buy real estate. Make the main thing housing. Okay. Sure. I mean, this is... I probably because of my years discussing these topics on YouTube, I'm under the assumption that people appreciate the fact that it's going to be impossible for someone with the minimum wage or low level wages to be actually to buy a house, particularly in Sydney, with just the prices that are there. The country's changed. It's just the way it is. You can bitch and moan and complain, and nothing is going to change. People will promise you all the bullshit, politicians. They'll promise you the world. And we've seen all the policies. If you go back a couple of years, we went through every single party that was running senators here at the election, and some of the policies are just batshit crazy. And they'll promise you the world, and the miners, some of them will never get in. It's all just bullshit. And, I mean, we don't know. Is this guy voting for policies? The young guy, he's young. You need to make sure you vote for policies that don't drive up your house prices. One of them is all of these environmental interventions that we're having. They're just upping the star rating on housing. And you think, okay, that's great. It's going to make houses more energy efficient. You'll save more money in the long run. Fantastic. But that adds to the cost. Okay, you need to have a $2,000 report written for every time you build a house. Okay, someone might air condition this space in the future, so we need to put all this insulation in there, all of this, and this. And I know why they do it, because there's a benefit to doing it at the early stages of construction, but you're removing that choice from the person building the project. So that's a cost that everyone has to bear, and it drives everything up. So the Treasurer says, nominal wages have picked up and are currently growing at a faster rate, the fastest rate in over a decade. Well, that's just inflation. A 0.9% rise in the wage price index in the December quarter means wages were 4.2% higher throughout the year, marking the equal fastest annual growth since 2009. Yeah, wages aren't going to go up. You want to increase your wages, you need to increase your skills, you need to increase what you can demand. You need to change jobs. I don't know if that's changed that much since the past. I think that's always been a rule. But the demand for housing, especially in our capital cities, is still outstripping wages growth as prices push beyond what is reasonably achievable for Aussies earning an average wage. Yes, it's not for average. Not in Sydney. Sydney, you can't be average. If you're average wage earner in Australia, you're not going to be buying in Sydney. That's the reality of it, everyone. Well, welcome to living in a country where there's high demand. Most people live, I think 50% of our population live in Brisbane, Sydney, or Melbourne. That's just how it is. If you want to live Sydney is a globally in-demand city. If you want to live there, you got to be above average. That's the reality of it. The only solution appears to be the bank of mum and dad. This is intergenerational wealth cementing the divide between the classes here in Australia. But you're always going to have an advantage if you've got a more stable family life. I'm assuming that's common knowledge. Correct me if I'm wrong, if that isn't the common knowledge for people out there. Those lacking rich parents who capitalized on relatively cheap housing last century, well, here's the thing. It didn't feel cheap to a lot of them. They were having to make a lot of sacrifices too to get into housing. And, it's like all of us in Brisbane who bought a decade ago. We're feeling like boomer property geniuses. It's just called luck. Or it's just called waiting for Brizzy to catch up to the rest of the country. I mean, good on the parents. They need to help out their family. That's the job of family. You're meant to help family. Isn't that a good thing? Maybe this will encourage more people to have families. So they've had to readjust their expectations and come to terms with the fact they will be paying someone else's mortgage through the rental system until after they retire. Okay, you're not paying someone. You need to stop thinking this bullshit that you're paying someone else's mortgage when you're paying rent. No, you are paying money for a service. They're providing you with accommodation. It may be a rip-off compared to what you're used to. You may not feel like it's worth the money that you're paying. And sure, they may be using that income to pay off their mortgage. That's their choice. But they're providing a service. Just think how much of a shit show it would be if we had no private landlords. If it was all just the government's job to provide all housing for everyone. How long would that take? It'd be a complete nightmare. And what would you rather? Would you rather have big corporations buying up all the housing or mum and dad Australians owning it? Where do you want the wealth? At least with this, we're getting some spread in the wealth here in Australia. And I know that that's a big problem of our country, that we're consolidating everything in housing, everything in property. But can you blame people? Can you blame them? What are you going to do? Put into a business? There's risks. You have to hire people every year. The wages go up. Every year legislation changes. More and more responsibilities put onto the business owner. There's a reason why everything's consolidating in bigger businesses. So he's featured as an auctioneer on the block. Well, then he's probably just making that worse. I've never watched The Block. I've never watched it. Is it good? Let me know. I'm assuming it's like those shows where they just get married at the beginning of them, or reality TV. Big Brother. Is Big Brother still a thing? Yeah, I'm showing my age now. In a video posted last week, he said a small cohort of agents were acting like bankers did before the GFC. It was a money trail. Do what you want, sell what you want, make money. Don't worry about the client, he said. This is going to be a party that's never going to end. But at some point, the hero moved from being the vendor, the client, the real estate agent decided to become the hero. Including the way they acted, the way they behaved, and even the way they marketed. In some properties, the way they marketed, the agent is more marketed than the actual home, and it's being funded by the vendor. Yeah, we've all seen the douchebag real estate agent videos where they're just playing themselves up. They all want to be actors. A lot of them, they want to be famous Hollywood stars, movie stars, social media stars. If it gets the views, it gets the views. If it gets the property sold, gets the attention to it, that's just how it happens. Perhaps like recording a video in a coffee shop and claiming a retail worker is never going to be able to save for a house. It gets the views, doesn't it? It gets an article. We're talking about it here. I'm at 5 a.m. discussing it. So let's have a look at Tuesday's budget. I haven't gone through it yet. After convening a national cabinet meeting on Saturday, Albanese announced a third $11.3 billion injection of additional funding to help accelerate new supply, combat homelessness, and assist those fleeing domestic violence with more crisis accommodation. In a tacit admission that its efforts to alleviate Australia's acute housing crisis has not been enough. The one thing I've seen from the budget to address this that I think is probably the best move is providing capacity to build infrastructure, because that's what we need. So that's a good move there on the Albanese government. I think a lot of the rest of it's going to struggle to be achieved because, just as we've discussed in the constant video after video of the housing apocalypse, the construction apocalypse. We're losing builders in the housing sector. Now, I would make the argument that one of the factors that's never mentioned that is playing into that is back when, a few years ago, when they allowed builders to trade while insolvent, that's laid the seeds to destroy a lot of businesses. And we're starting to see the spike in insolvencies now. So, if there's the thing. We see the fear articles as well. Insolvencies there's the thing. We see the fear articles as well. Insolvencies are high, skyrocketing. They're just returning to normal, everyone. And the government changed the rules on the fly due to their their interventions into the economy to mitigate COVID. And there's consequences to that. Nothing is without a consequence. Nothing is free. Okay, you can't just click your fingers and housing appears everywhere. This is going to be what we're seeing here. To be brutally honest, I think we'll be discussing for decades moving forward, and it's just going to exacerbate the class divide here in Australia. Australia's a rather egalitarian society. You have people there in the coffee shops sitting next to, multi-millionaires with a huge property and investment portfolio sitting next to, young guy going to uni with bugger all to his name. That's just how our country is. And we'll see. We'll see how that lasts. When key housing stakeholders like Homelessness Australia and Master Builders have thrown their support behind the government's pre-budget announcement, the Coalition and Greens have both slammed the package. Michael Sukkar, the Coalition's housing spokesman, said the announcement was a fraud on the Australian people. It's a catastrophe that the government has confirmed there will be nothing in the budget to address or alleviate Labor's housing crisis. Okay, now, this is kind of a bullshit move on the Coalition. You can't just, I know they do this all the time. All the problems are just pushed onto the other guy. Oh, this is Labor's housing crisis. There was no housing crisis under the Coalition. We were all superstars and angels, which is bullshit. Okay, we all know this has been an ongoing issue for years, and frankly, even when you look at the old footage from like the 80s or the 50s or the 60s, even the 70s from the ABC that they have out there, of young couples bitching and moaning about how expensive it is to buy a house and losing property to speculators. This has never not been an issue. This has always been a problem. The only thing is, it's just a lot of young people are realizing they're not going to have the same lifestyle as their parents. Because, well, when their parents bought, their lifestyle wasn't the same as they have now. Greens housing spokesman, Max Chandler-Mather, slammed Labor for repackaging a Morrison government housing and homelessness agreement and announcing a $1 billion package for social housing secured by the minor party in negotiations last year and pretending both are new. What Labor has actually announced today is no extra money for social housing, nothing for renters, and no plan to cap rents. This is a fake announcement and a disaster for renters. He said, the bloody Greens, this idiot pushing for rent caps. You don't want that. We don't want market interventions. If we start capping rents, if we start screwing around with the market with regards to allowing landlords to rent, it's going to have tremendously negative consequences. Nowhere in the world, nowhere in history have these type of interventions, rent controls, have they worked. Look at Ireland as a recent example of what happened to their rental market when they started making some changes. In the whole country, the number of property, people just said, stuff this, I'm out. Sold up and left. Now here's the thing, you're thinking, oh, fantastic, a family can buy a house. Maybe, but that's also a property that is no longer available to rent for people. We need rental stock. People need to be able to move around. People need to be able to find a house. People need to be able to rent. Today's announcement is worse than tinkering around the edges. It's locking in the status quo and will do nothing to tackle a housing crisis that is destroying millions of lives. I think he's a bit of a stretch there. I mean, it's not destroying millions of lives. It's just millions of people are facing reality that Australia's changing. And of course, it's just the status quo. The two major parties don't want to take the radical action necessary to change, to make housing more affordable. The Greens won't. They're playing around the edges. If you want to make housing affordable, strip out tremendous amounts of the environmental performance requirements and regulations out of the code. Create incentives for developers to build 2-bedroom starter homes that people can extend themselves. Why not? Change the way we do things. There used to be a whole push for people building their own homes back in the day. Why don't we look at that again? You build the garage first and then build the rest later. The lion's share of the package will be $9.3 billion worth of fresh funds to establish the new 5-year national agreement on social housing and homelessness, with support to administered by state and territory governments. Now, I have not looked through this, guys. Can you tell me in the comments, are we getting any men's shelters? Are there going to be any capacity for a man who's fleeing intimate partner violence with his children to be housed? And I know that's people like to pretend that IPV isn't bilateral, but it is, and there's no capacity for a man to leave that environment with his kids. And this may be shocking to some of the rabid feminists there. A lot of us dads really love our children. So I know the answer. I don't know why I'm even asking. I know the answer. Representing a doubling of the federal homelessness funding to $400 million a year, the states and territories will be cumulatively required to match the increased Commonwealth spending dollar for dollar, ramping up crisis support and social housing supply. Fantastic. States heavily indebted are now going to... it doesn't matter. They're just spending all our money, guys. They can make all the promises in the world. Speaking from Tasmania, Albanese said Labor's Homes for Australian plan would keep the dream of home ownership within reach by bolstering supply. I mean, he's right. We need to increase supply. But just throwing more money at it is not the only solution. This is a very complicated problem. You've got state, you've got local, you've got council, state and federal government that all need to come together to make things easier for people to make land more available. I'm still reflecting on the councils in northern New South Wales bitching and moaning and blaming the federal government because of the housing issues they were having. And you've got to wonder who's been kicking back development opportunities. Who's making it harder and harder for people to split off farmland or rezoning for more housing? Is that the federal government or the local council? Only Labor is committed to building more homes. Only Labor is committed to practical policies to go forward, which is what we have done with our $25 billion before these announcements. Yeah, okay. I mean, I think only the coalition is arguing for... letting people use their own money. Let's have a chat about this one, guys, because there's a few things here that pisses me off, to be quite frank. So, what do you reckon? I mean, going and recording a video in a coffee shop and saying that this cafe worker will never be able to afford a house. I mean, we all know this is a job. Well, okay, for the females watching there, from a male perspective, this is just a shit kicker job you got to do as you're building yourself up. Okay, I mean, that's the reality. If you don't have ambition, you're going to struggle to get into housing. And that's for everyone. So if you think you can just go work a low-skilled job, and don't get me wrong, baristas are important, but, I mean, there's a robot replacing the jobs at my 7-Eleven that I love attending. I remember we used to have an office next to a little coffee shop. There you go, get a, cute girl would make you a brilliant coffee, and then the owners actually turfed her out because they couldn't afford it. And then he got his parents in to make coffee, and it tasted like shit. But the point being, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you can't learn in a week to make coffee. Well, you can. We still were buying it. It takes a bit longer to make good coffee, but how often will you drink a shit coffee and just palm it off? But the thing is, we've got to appreciate the fact that these are stepping stone jobs. Maybe in the past they weren't, but they are now. And you've got to treat it like that. You can live in the fantasy that everyone's promising you that they'll fix it, that they'll get more housing supply, that they'll up the minimum wage, they'll up this, and this. They're just telling you that to get, your attention, your eyeballs, to get your vote. And you've got to take a step away and realize, wait a minute, this is bullshit. I've got to take the steps I need to ensure I can take another path. And that may be you've got to move out of Sydney. You got to go, you know what? Stuff this city. I've got to move. I've got to find somewhere more affordable to live. I had viewers reach out to me. They moved to Brisbane or Queensland to find much more affordable housing out of Sydney. You may think, but I want to stay near my family, and I understand. I appreciate that. But your family may need to sell too if they want to be near you. If the grandparents want to be near the grandkids, they need to sell the multi-million-dollar huge house they have, which they don't need anymore, and retire somewhere cheaper. Keep the market moving. The world around where you're living has changed. The amenities, the needs, the requirements. One project we were looking at was working with a developer to densify in a city with townhouses for older couples who no longer needed the big family house, could sell out and buy in. So what do you reckon about that one, guys? Do you think it's right portraying the expectation that someone on a minimum wage, retail level job should be able to buy a house in one of the most in-demand cities in the world? I think that's a fantasy. I think you haven't kept up with where Australia's going. It's kind of bullshit, honestly. The government's moves, we'll have to go through the budget in another video, but we'll see where it goes. I'm skeptical, honestly. They're just going to throw more money at everything, it's going to continue to overheat the market. I mean, things have calmed down now, depending on what sector you're in. Some are just going insane. But this is what happens. If you throw money at housing or at any sector, you're going to overheat it. And prices are going to go up, and it's just going to be harder to deliver what you want to deliver. That's the reality of it. We've seen that in our housing market. I think that was I wonder if it was unintended or it was just the sacrifice they were willing to make with the home builder program. Anyway, guys, thank you all for watching. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on this one, and I'll see you in the next episode of HeiseSays. Bye for now.